Hi guys, greetings from Mexico and welcome to my second edition of Run the Gauntlet. I'm not sure how much you can see. I've had a few difficulties this month after tearing all of the ligaments in my shoulders, so apologies that this edition is a little later than I had planned on sharing it. But I'm so excited this month to bring to you Augural by Jessica Manko. Run the Gauntlet is a program where very brave writers submit their work, sometimes anonymously, in this case not, for a live developmental kind of assessment. And by sharing their work with others, they share the insights from that assessment so that everyone can benefit from the devices and techniques that we look at. And hopefully we can foster a kind of community of sharing and support, because writing can be a pretty lonely journey, and it's wonderful to be able to really learn along the way with each other. Not all of us are lucky enough to be part of writers groups, so in some ways I kind of see this as an online writers group. So thank you, Jessica, so much for taking part and for sharing your work with us. Now this is a manuscript of science fiction. It's new adult audience. It's Jessica's second novel. She wrote a manuscript before this one, which was a little long, a little unwieldy, a little unstructured. And so she's taken all of the lessons she learned in that first experience and applied them to this second draft that she's a little more confident about, and is hoping to either have published or self-published if possible. Her big inspiration in the past has been Andre Norton, actually a female writer writing under a male pseudonym. And if any of you are sci-fi readers, I'm sure you're familiar with her work. It gives you a bit of an idea of where Jessica is coming from in terms of her past inspiration and the kinds of stories that she wants to tell. Now the topics that we'll be covering today are crafting compelling dialogue and interior monologue. One of those little things that once you get it in your head and you understand the different ways each of these tools can be used, it becomes really intuitive and effortless. But there are some great techniques that we can actively learn and apply in this manuscript. Point of view, another thing that is really important across all genres of storytelling, particularly relevant in sci-fi, because in sci-fi we tend to adopt omniscient styles of narration. We've been very shaped by all of the authors in sci-fi who write with omniscient narration, and sometimes it's an excellent creative choice. Other times it can foster a deeper relationship between the reader and the character to just focus that point of view in on one character as opposed to jumping across the heads of too many different figures in the story. So we'll also look at that, and obviously world building. How much do we need to know and when? How do we create an authentic world without beginning to potentially compete with other story elements like plot and character development? And finally, introducing protagonists, something that we will cover in probably all episodes of Run the Gauntlet, because ultimately this program is all about assessing opening scenes, and the really key objective of your opening scenes is to introduce a compelling protagonist that we want to emotionally invest in some ways and follow on their journey. So without further ado, I'm really excited to bring to you Jessica's book, Augural, and we'll begin here at the preface. Myths which are believed in tend to become true, George Orwell. I'm not always a fan of opening quotes because sometimes I think they're a bit superfluous, but in this case we have a quote that definitely creates a sense of intrigue. What's the myth? How is it believed in? How does it become true? How does this relate to what's going to happen in the story? So that it's a question that we want to see answered, and I think in that sense it works really well. Now if we move on to chapter 1, I actually think this is more of a, in structural terms, is probably more of a prologue. And, we could even have, prologue as the heading and then that quote by George Orwell and then go straight into this scene, but I'll discuss that a little bit more further on. Her breathing was quick, the sweat slowly dripping down her forehead, even in the confines of the air-conditioned helmet. Her heart beating hard and fast, she looked around the airlock in an almost jerky motion, then froze when she saw the bodies stacked like cordwood against one wall. So obviously a very impactful, attention-grabbing opener. The bodies of her shipmates, her friends, all close to her from many years of exploring the unknown reaches of the galaxy. She was oblivious to anything else, trying to make sense of what was happening to her, what had happened to her friends. The airlock door suddenly opened, etc. So you could see here how we have this, big, impactful punch of, this female character being in this room with these bodies, which is really heavy and filled with horror, but the scene continues to flow quite quickly beyond that point as the airlock door opens and suddenly she's stifling a scream and spinning around. My feeling is that there's room here to give the full impact of that horror a little bit more breathing space. We don't want to rush the emotional development here, and we can really, at the moment, these bodies in the corner feel almost like stage props. And I think that we can afford to humanize them a little bit to allow us to better understand the pain of what she's lost. So maybe the larger body in the corner, it's significantly bigger than the others, and she knows that that's the body of Tom, their engineer. Maybe there's a smaller body stacked above it, and that is the body of Annika, who was their navigator and always the first to laugh in a tense situation. But now this character finds herself in this room with the heaviest, most oppressive, stifling silence that she's ever experienced. But this is a really heavy, dramatic moment, so let's give it the space and description and detail that it deserves, that it warrants. Because if we kind of rush through it too quickly, then we can almost make it slightly gimmicky, and we've kind of brought up something potentially really powerful and then moved on to the next shiny object before we've really humanized it and done it justice. I've got another minor note here, which is that in general I'd argue against introducing any characters by name if they don't have a role to play in the story. So you might say the larger body bag was the engineer, and by saying engineer as opposed to Tom, we're saying to the reader, we're giving you context of who this side character is, but by not introducing you by name, we're also hinting that you don't need to remember him, you don't need to file him away in your mental bank, because he doesn't have an ongoing role to play in the story beyond this point. In this instance, the characters are deceased, so I think that you can afford to mention them by name, and the reader will intuitively know that they don't have to remember them, but a name will also humanize them that little bit more and allow the horror and impact of this moment to come through with a little more strength and clarity. She was oblivious to anything else, trying to make sense of what was happening to her, what had happened to her friends. The airlock door suddenly opened and she stifled a scream as she spun around to look. A helmeted figure entered, pushing a cart with 2 more bodies for the pile. "Emily, how are you holding up?" asked the figure in a calm, deep voice. I don't know, Captain," she replied. She tried to slow her breathing. "This is the last of the crew. I made one final pass through." "Captain, what is this?" she burst out, fighting to control the panic that was welling up within her. "What is happening to us?" "I don't know, Emily. I wish to God I did, but I don't. Dr. Heslop and his team tried everything they knew before they died and couldn't figure it out. And now what, Captain?" "We open the airlock and dispose of the bodies like we did the rest." So I'll pause here to just say, for me, reading this the first time with fresh eyes, I kind of experienced a slight sense of contradiction, because the opening description has Emily, the character, looking around the room, her heart beating, she's sweating, she's almost about to kind of pass out, and then she spots the bodies and stops, and it's like this real shock moment. And to me, it almost, that level of panic and confusion seems to suggest that these deaths have just happened or she has just discovered them. And so from a contextual point of view as a reader, we're kind of thinking that the threat is imminent. There's almost, someone on board has been killing everyone and she's just discovered their terrible crime. Now that sends a really different message, or kind of sets up to have us to have a different perception of the immediate risk and threat than what this section of the story seems to imply, which is that these people have been dying over time. They've had the time to collect their bodies. They've had the time to study those bodies. This was a large crew. Everyone didn't just die overnight. They died in stages. So in a way, I'm thinking, well, if this has been going on for some time, then why is this character in the room in the first place? Well, she's probably come in to say goodbye to her friends, or to sit and look at them and try and puzzle it out, or that she is so dejected and hopeless about the fact that they're all going to die, that there is no hope anymore, that she's kind of swamped with grief. But if that's the case, and that seems to be the most logical explanation for the action we've seen so far, and the context that we do have, then I would imagine that she would be less panicked and confused, the kind of reaction we might see if someone trying to escape a burning house, for example. And she might be, hopeless and desperate, but it would have a different kind of vibe. We're going to explore that and relate that to the reader in a different way. That will then feel like it's more cohesive and more in line with the interaction that follows with the captain. But if a rescue team comes, they would want to examine them, wouldn't they? We can't risk exposing them to whatever this is. I've left a private log, and so has Dr. Heslop. If the rescuers find either, they will know as much as we do, even though it isn't much. And what of us? She whispered. He moved closer so that she could see his face through the visor. His smile was reassuring, but his eyes said otherwise. Emily, he began, then he stopped. What could he say that was different from what they both knew? Now, this is a really important turning point in the scene because, as you'll see in the action that's about to follow, we offer the reader a bit of a twist, an unexpected twist. What I would say is that I think that there's room at this point to just add a few additional lines of context, and that is to reinforce the idea that they are the last two people alive on board. I think that we could state that more explicitly, as opposed to, this is a very short scene. Readers will read through it very quickly, and it could be easy to kind of miss elements like that. They're the last two people alive on board this ship, and they cannot allow for bodies to be left on the ship, because rescuers or whoever might come next could then be exposed to whatever it is that's killing them. So, if you combine those two thoughts, they're the last two people and no two bodies can be left, then we're foreshadowing the doom of what is about to happen. He moved closer so that she could see his face through the visor. His smile was reassuring, but his eyes said otherwise. Emily, he began, then stopped. What could he say that was different from what they both knew? He smiled once more, his eyes softened. He was at ease now. He embraced her as best he could in the bulky suit and held on to her. She felt safe in his grasp, her breathing returning to normal, her heartbeat slowing. She was prepared. He slowly pulled his laser pistol from its holster, hesitated once, then fired. She felt nothing. He reholstered the pistol, depressurized the airlock, then opened the outer door. He said a prayer as he slowly slid the bodies one by one out into space. So really dramatic moment there. I love the shock of this moment. Right away we're saying to this reader that this story will be spontaneous. It will be full of surprises. If you can look for a turning point in every scene where we're kind of leading the reader's expectations down one path, that everyone around them is dying and they have to find a way to survive. They have to find an answer to this problem if they're going to make it, to suddenly this outcome, which is neither of them are going to make it, but through a valiant act of self-sacrifice, they can try and ensure that the people who come after them don't suffer the same fate. It's a wonderful twist or turning point that just keeps the reader on the edge of their seat, on the tip of their toes, and tells them that This story will not be predictable. In hindsight, you might look back at the action and see that it makes perfect sense and it's an authentic extension of the character's goals and actions and motivations, but that, you know, we are going to take you in surprising places. And I think that is a wonderful message to give the reader as they're taking their first tentative steps into your story. You'll also see that I've just highlighted some of these repetitive sentence starts. So whenever we fall into patterns as writers, and often when you've gone through a draft 3 or 4 times, you just become blind to these kinds of things. I mean, potentially it could have been done deliberately, because the he, she format does have its own kind of rhythmic, you know, almost hypnotic kind of style, which I actually like, but that seems to continue in other parts of this scene, so I'm assuming it's an oversight rather than a deliberate choice. Either way, what happens when we have these kinds of patterns in the narrative, the reader spots them because they have fresh eyes, so they have more objectivity to spot these little anomalies. And when we see things like this, it creates a point of distraction. We're losing ourselves in this incredibly powerful moment in this time and place with these terrible things happening, and then suddenly we're aware of the mechanics of the writing, and we're aware of the fact that we're looking at words on a page. So we want to avoid those little moments of distraction as much as possible and ensure that the reader is always as engrossed in the story and unaware of the mechanics, wherever we can kind of ensure that. And if we choose to play with the sentence structure or make creative statements, that it definitely justifies the distraction and embellishes the story in an important way. When he was finished, he stood in the doorway and watched the bodies float away. He wished he could have given them better. He wished he knew what killed them, but he knew the answers were for someone else to figure out. He set the timer on the door, said one more prayer, and stepped out into oblivion. So obviously a really powerful opening scene. It's 470 words, so it's relatively short considering how much it covers. As I started saying earlier, I think that there's room here to add to the description potentially of some of the, you know, moments of horror to really impress upon the reader just how awful this is, and the feelings of the characters as they go through this terrible moment. The other thing I would say though is that even if that lengthens the scene, it still feels a little short to sustain 2 points of view. So we start the scene in Emily's point of view and her experience, and then we shift to the captain's. I think that actually the transition between those 2 points of view is quite effective in that once Emily dies, we naturally go to, you know, the captain's point of view because he's the only living person left in the scene. Even so, I feel that every time we transition from one point of view to the other, it's a little jarring, distracting. We have to in that moment shift slightly from one context to another context, and I think that for a scene this short you could just as easily convey the whole scene from the captain's point of view. It would be slightly more cohesive. You could still preserve the shock of what it is he's about to do, so that when he does shoot her it still comes through with lots of impact. But also we might have an opportunity by conveying the scene through his point of view throughout. We might also be able to deepen his motivations, convictions and feelings a little bit more, so that we better understand that they really are the two people left on board and they don't have any other choice here. This is the end for both of them. So I think there's room to kind of build up that impression. It's lost a little bit at the moment because of Emily's panic at the start. We don't really know if there's a monster about to burst through the door or, you know, what's going on. The other point that I have here is that as we move into this next scene, we're in a completely different time, a different place, different ship, and different cast of characters. So for me, in structural terms, instead of having a preface with the quote and then chapter 1 with Emily in the captain's scene and now this new scene with a whole new cast, it would make more sense to have prologue, the George Orwell quote, or even the George Orwell quote, then the prologue and Emily and the captain's scene, And then, really assuming that this is where we meet our key protagonist and the actual front story is beginning, then this is really our chapter 1. Coming into orbit around Augural 3 now, Captain. Obviously, mentioning Augural 3 up front, I think, is a good move. We know that's the title of the book, so straight away we know that we have jumped into the most relevant plot line now, and that the central story is starting, and that those initial scenes were a little bit of backstory to help foreshadow the trouble to come and help explain what has happened thus far. All ship systems operating normal, Captain. Still no contact with Fleet or the Science Ministry, ma'am. Marta Donahue sat in silence as she watched the main viewer and listened to the bridge staff issue their reports. She and the crew had been together on the Exeter for the last 5 months training for this mission, then the flight here, and although they were beginning to come together as a crew, she still had an uneasy feeling about the whole assignment. At least she was able to bring along some of her staff from the Trident after that ship was decommissioned. A small blessing, a very small blessing. I love that she has referenced that she feels uneasy about this assignment. I think that's great. I think that's a point we could elaborate on a little bit more, because it creates a great sense of tension and intrigue, and also allows us from a character development perspective to empathize with her a little more and feel for her as she's going into this kind of uncharted territory. What I would say is that I'm not sure that we need the details about the Exeter and the Trident and the Science Ministry, etc. And that if we are going to cover those details, it can be really helpful to show more and tell less, so that that backstory has a greater sense of relevance. So, for example, she has had an old ship, the Trident, that has her old crew, and now she's come in and combined with this new crew. Now, if there's tension between old and new, so like the old guard maybe comes from the equivalent of the private sector, and they have a kind of Yahoo cowboy way of doing things, and the new crew is like the equivalent of, say, a military crew or a government crew that's very by the book, and let's say there's tension between the two factions of this crew that she's now the head of, we can show that in a scene, show the tensions between those people, show how this is possibly foreshadowing, a problem that's going to flare up down the line. And then we can provide a bit of backstory as to where both groups have come from, which explain, why there is this tension between them. As it is, it's just a set of details that we've kind of inserted into the scene, which aren't necessary. These details aren't necessary or essential for us to have in order to understand the action that follows. So they're just details for us to kind of keep track of, and really the priority at this point is to connect with Marta. So while it can be really tempting to set up, world building elements or plot elements, exposition and backstory, we don't want to do that at the cost of the reader's focus and connection being where it's best invested, which is the protagonist, what they care about, and why we should in turn care about them. Keep a close eye out for any East Pacific Alliance ships, she said as she stood to stretch and look around the bridge. Why, Captain, they all scooted back to their home ports with their tails tucked between their legs after Orion, said Ivan Colin, the pilot, in his easygoing drawl. None of them have ventured out since then. He looked over at her with his kindly eyes. So, just to reiterate the point I just made, we're 180 words into this scene, but we've already covered or introduced Augural 3, the Fleet, the Science Ministry, the Trident, I think, was the old ship, the Exeter is the new ship, East Pacific Alliance ships, an Orion event, and 4 or 5 different characters. It's a lot to take in a short space, and we're stretching the reader's attention thin. So I always say in opening scenes, particularly in sci-fi, where there is a bigger burden on the writer to shape the world building, yes, we want world building, but make sure it's directly relevant to what's happening in this scene and our understanding of this scene. If it's relevant to the greater story, maybe introduce it in 2 or 3 chapters' time. But our first and foremost priority is understanding Marta, because until we care about Marta, until we're invested in her on some kind of personal level, the external elements that are going to impact her life are less relevant to us. Once we care about her, then, we're going to care about those elements as well, and the impact they might have on her. We're not going to care about as much about the Titanic sinking unless we first care about Jack and Rose. So, it's character first and then plot second. The two support each other, but there is an order to how we ensure that the reader is compelled to delve deeper and deeper into the story. She and the gangly Texan had served together for over 5 years. Just the same, mister, I want to make sure in case one of them feels a wee bit brave or lucky. Understood, ma'am. Locked into orbit now. She smiled slightly, then the burning sensation in her hands returned. Not painful, not even an irritant, just there, almost in the background, but there. She looked over to her executive officer, forcing herself to ignore the feeling. Nice little point of intrigue. Number 1, she said, landing platform status. Going through the last of the checklist as we speak, Captain, he replied. Lev Sokolsky was considered to be the best first officer in the fleet, and the two of them had been close friends since their days at the academy. He was tall, well-built, with close-cut black hair and intense dark eyes that sat over a patrician nose. Quick with a smile or his fists, he was someone you wanted watching your back. Wonderful little details here, but in the greater context of all the details we've covered to this point, they kind of get lost in the wash. And I know that, in 6 chapters' time, if you ask me who's the Texan and who's the one with the fast fists, I'm probably going to struggle to recall those details because my mind is having to hold quite a bit by this point. So think about how you can introduce your characters with a greater sense of impact, assuming they are really central and vital to the story. We might have, a quick reference to this character in this scene, but it's not until, say, the next scene where the captain is walking past an open door and she hears Lev threaten one of the other characters that we really have crafted an opportunity to see him and his personality attributes firsthand, again showing instead of telling. If he's fast with a smile and fast with his fists, let's craft a scene that captures him interacting in that way so that it's seared into our minds. If it's just one more detail in a long list of details buried in a lot of narrative, chances are we kind of skim past it or struggle to hold it all, and that can create a sense in the reader that they're not as deeply engaged with the story as they should be, that they're potentially missing bits or allowing bits to slip past them, and that's always going to happen in every story, but we want to avoid it as much as possible, especially in the opening scenes where it's a really great opportunity to introduce plot elements and character profiles with impact. Let me know when the platform is ready to be launched, she said, as she sat back down and looked at the main viewer screen again. The northern half of the planet seemed to be completely encased in an angry, swirling mass of dark grey and dirty white clouds. Popping up everywhere in an uneven order were bright spots indicating enormous lightning strikes. Bloody hell, I hope that storm isn't some sort of an omen, she thought, as a slight involuntary shiver went down her back. Now, notice here that when we're reading this line, because it's in quotations, we read that as her speaking aloud to her crew. But then we suddenly get to this point where we learn that she's thought this, not spoken aloud. And that's a little point of kind of jarring confusion. Now, if we come over here, I've got an example of how a lot of writers choose to format their interior dialogue or monologue. So as you can see here, bloody hell, I hope that storm isn't some sort of an omen. Put that in italics, and then when we get to she thought, we know that she hasn't said this aloud, so there's no moment of confusion. Even better is to replicate how people actually think. Now, unless you're like incredibly neurotic and you have these long internal conversations with yourself, which not many people have, it's a pretty unique character trait. In general, we kind of think in snippets and fragments. So we'll curse internally, we'll go bloody hell internally, but we won't go bloody hell, that was a hard day. Why does this always happen to me? why is life always so difficult on Mondays? We'll go bloody hell, and then we'll have a more of a swamping feeling of depression and frustration, which might have fragments of little thoughts in it, but it's not necessarily going to involve us having a long internal conversation with ourselves. It's just not how most people think. So we can kind of replicate that in the narrative for a more authentic interpretation of her thoughts and feelings. So if you see this example here, bloody hell, we've got that as the internal dialogue, something that she's actually thinking. But then we go, she thought as a slight involuntary shiver went down her back. Hopefully the storm wasn't some sort of omen. So by having this section as part of the general kind of narrative, then we are showing it as a kind of feeling or intuition that she has, or a foreboding that she has, because we're in her point of view. So we know that these insights in the narrative are her thoughts or extensions of her perspective. We don't need to put them in long lines of interior dialogue. And by doing this, we create a deeper sense of connection with the character as well, because we're hearing her internal thoughts, but we're also kind of experiencing her feelings. And it's just a little less kind of clunky, I would say. So use the narrative in that way to express a character's thoughts without necessarily having to format them as distinct internal language. She touched a button on the control panel on her chair. Mr. Yar Ardua, she called. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Jessica. I am terrible at pronouncing sci-fi names. To her science officer. What's the status of the storm below us? Our best estimate is that the storm will dissipate in approximately 3 hours, Captain, he replied in a deep baritone voice. Very good. Keep me up to date. I want to launch the landing platform as soon as the storm clears, she said before switching off the intercom. She looked around the compact bridge of the Exeter. There wasn't much room to move around the 12 stations that helped keep the ship operating, the light color scheme attempting to give the illusion of a larger space without much success. Yet the cruiser was one of the latest design, with enlarged work and crew spaces and outfitted with the improvised Jemison faster-than-light engines. Now, I'm going to pause here to do something a little bit sneaky. I am introducing, to run the Gauntlet, a code word. And you might ask yourself, why on earth would you need a code word? Well, I was astounded at the number of applications we received this month. It was fantastic and heartening. But I want to introduce a code word to the program so that when writers submit their manuscripts, for inclusion, if they mention the code word, then I know that they aren't just wanting to submit for a live edit, but they are actually taking part in the program, watching the edits, and really playing more of a role in the program and its community. So this month's code word, in honor of the fact that I'm currently in Mexico, is cactus. So if you are planning on submitting your manuscript for On the Gauntlet, please jot down that word cactus and remember to include it in your application, because it will give you a special edge. Bloody hell, she thought. I've highlighted that in yellow just because we had bloody hell earlier, and we want to avoid repetitions where we can. How did they do this in the smaller ships before FTL? I'm not sure if that is a typo or a sci-fi reference that I'm missing. Captain, still no contact with the fleet or the science ministry, said Lieutenant Bartolome Guerrero, the communications officer. I can't explain it. There is no reason we shouldn't be able to contact them, and yet, keep trying, mister, she said as she looked once more at the main viewer. That's got to be one hell of a storm down there, she thought again. I always say, deepen our insight. Don't repeat something that we already know. We already know she thinks it's one hell of a storm down there. So instead of repeating yourself, use every line to push the story forward in some way. So maybe she notices something about the storm that she's never noticed before that suggests it's even more serious. Or maybe we use this line to hint at a moment of insecurity that she has inside herself, or that this might remind her of a past event that ended disastrously or something. But there are lots of different ways to encourage us to connect with her or to anticipate danger to come, and simply repeating the same information is kind of a waste of space. Captain Lieutenant Commander Ya Ardua here. Go ahead. We have an update on the weather, ma'am, and I'm afraid that the news is no good. Give it to me, mister. We have revamped our estimates, and it now looks like it will be 4 hours before the landing platform can be safely launched. You told me 3. I understand, Captain, he interrupted gently, but this is a new phenomenon for us, and we are trying to understand the nature of it as quickly as possible. Very well, 4 hours then? So here I've got a few comments, just avoiding redundancies or stating the obvious. We don't necessarily have to have characters speak out aloud all the time. Keep in mind, I think I read a study a few years ago that 75% of communication happens through body language. We don't even rely on spoken word necessarily to convey frustration or anger or hope or whatever it is. So, this is where you can use subtext, where there can be an unspoken message delivered between the characters that isn't spoken aloud, adding nuance and layers to the communication as it unfolds. So, we have revamped our estimates, and it now looks like it will be 4 hours before the landing platform is launched. Martha frowned. They couldn't afford an additional hour. I understand, Captain, ... So he's cutting her off. He's seeing her frown. He's seeing that she's unhappy, and he's rushing to explain himself. But in that little interaction, instead of Martha saying, well, I'm not happy with it being an extra hour, which is slightly obvious, we're just showing that her crew can read her expression and try and kind of come back and reassure her before she has a chance to express her disappointment. Just getting that back. Okay. An 80% chance probability, Captain. Try to make it 100%, Sekau. Captain out. And here I'm just saying, this is our main introduction to Marta. So yes, we know that she's a captain. Yes, we know that she says things like bloody hell, which suggests maybe that she's got a kind of English background or Irish, some part of the UK, potentially even Australian. She has that kind of manner about her. But ultimately, if she's just repeating information back to her crew that has just been given to her, it's slightly repetitive to read, but it's also robbing us of a chance to deepen our understanding of who Marta is. What are her strengths and weaknesses? What are her unique personality traits? The more we can breed familiarity between her and the reader, the more the reader understands her particular traits on a deeper level. And keep in mind that fiction is larger than life, so we can afford to kind of, overblow those traits a little bit when we want to make an impact. Then the reader is going to move away from this scene with a strong impression of who she is. If she's just repeating information back and forth, that doesn't tell us as much as it could. She closed her eyes for a moment and leaned back in her chair. Bloody hell, now I'm going to have to listen to our 2 passengers piss and moan about the wait. She stood and stretched once more. Number 1, she said, you have the con. I'll be in my ready room. Let me know immediately if there are any changes, no matter how minor. So I love dialogue when the language or tone tells us something important about the characters. Maybe they're hiding something. Maybe there's a subtext, something that they won't admit out aloud but that everyone in the room is thinking. Maybe they're too aggressive in how they express themselves, and this hints at something that will be problematic for them down the line, or an internal wound from their past that we might be curious about. But there are so many ways to deepen your character development through the way people talk to each other. Now, if your interaction between 2 characters is purely practical and we're just covering details, like we need to cover the fact that she's about to leave the room, we don't need to necessarily put that into dialogue. We could just as easily included in action description and narrative kind of summary. So for example, she stood and stretched, telling her second in command to update her of any developments, no matter how minor. For now, it was time to go and get some rest. So we've cut out all those particular lines of dialogue that they've exchanged and just updated the reader as to the essential facts, maintaining the pace of the story, not getting bogged down in detail. We're also training the reader to see dialogue as something important and an opportunity for insight. We don't use dialogue to just express, practicalities in the story. If you do see quotation marks, you're going to see an exchange between two characters that will hopefully carry multiple levels of meaning and insight. I captain. She walked over to a door on the left side of the bridge, and as it swooshed open, walked into the cramped room. The room had barely enough space for her desk, which did double duty as a conference table and 4 chairs, but her chair was comfortable enough for the quick nap she would take from time to time, and the room boasted a rather large portal that afforded her magnificent views. She sat in her chair and buzzed the galley. "Yes, Captain," said a voice at the other end. "Please send up a pot of tea." "Yes, ma'am, right away." Again, this is another example of summary potentially being a more concise option for this character. For example, she buzzed the galley and ordered a pot of tea. We don't need 4 or 5 lines of dialogue to achieve that same development. If we want to make a point about how powerful she is and how urgently, promptly people follow her orders and that she's respected as a captain, we might say, for example, she buzzed the galley and ordered a pot of tea, piping hot and strong. "Yes, Captain," came the speedy reply. We can still indicate the same without having to go through, a longer, more detailed exchange. Because ultimately, the words that we put on a page, it's always about the return on investment. How much is this telling us? If 50 words only tell us something minor, then chances are those 50 words need to be working harder to justify their, representation in your story or their inclusion in your story. If they're not returning enough on that investment, rethink how you can summarize and condense them as much as possible. If those let's see how many words it is, 29 words. If those 29 words provide a real hint that something is amiss, or there is a subtext of some sort, or there is an important choice that she's about to make, or a more important insight into one of her motivations, or an important clue that will come up later, then that's a great return on investment. So make sure that you're investing your words as effectively as possible. That's how we maintain the pace in a scene, even when there might not be that much immediate action going on. She leaned back in her chair and stared serenely out the portal and the massive storm on the planet below. It wasn't long before there was a quick knock on the door. "Enter," she said. "Your tea, Captain," said the young orderly as he hurriedly placed the small tray containing the teapot and a mug on her desk. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" "No, that will be all, thank you," she said as she poured the hot liquid into the mug. Again, not much of a return on investment on these words, so my feeling is that you can condense a lot of this and think about where could we be putting the reader's attention right now that is going to foreshadow trouble to come or deepen our understanding of her motivations, etc. As the young man left the room, she brought the steaming cup up to her nose and took a deep breath, savoring the aroma, before gingerly taking a sip of the hot liquid. Minor note, but avoid repetitions where possible. There are programs like Pro Writing Aid that will highlight repetitions in your manuscript so that you can manually go through and clean them up if you want to do that before paying an editor to go through and copy edit the work for you. She placed the mug back down on her desk, closed her eyes, and thought about the events that brought her here. It was 6 months ago on Earth, and she was called into a meeting by Admiral Zolnerowicz, head of fleet intelligence. ... And so the next scene obviously goes into her backstory. But my final thoughts, I will pause the edit here because I think we've covered a lot. And I think that we have some really good insights to explore, and a few final points. I think that this scene does a lot to introduce the world that she's in, introduce her crew, the fact that they're circling a planet that's We've got a huge storm, which provides a bit of tension, and we certainly sense that Marta is respected. Her orders are followed, but I think that ultimately, what is it that makes us want to follow Marta on this mission? What makes us want to invest and engage with her on a personal level? And that is understanding why this mission is personal to her. Yes, she's a captain, she's doing her job, but how do we go beyond that? Is she someone who, let's say her father was a really famous captain in the force, and she's always kind of been living in his shadow, and maybe one of her deep internal desires is to step out of his shadow, and maybe that leads her to prove herself and make impulsive, reckless decisions at times. She tries to forge a path and reputation for herself that is bigger than her father's. Now, we're not necessarily going to explain all of that in an opening scene, but we can certainly show her interactions, choices, and decisions in a way that hints that there is this internal kind of broiling issue going on that both allows us to makes her more compelling as a character, encourages us to find out more about her, and ultimately gives us an idea of why this is more than just a job or set of tasks for her. This is some kind of personal mission, and that mission comes with wonderful things in that she has a lot of strengths as a character. She might be more courageous. She might be really whip smart. But she also has an Achilles heel. She could be a little too reckless or a little too impulsive. And potentially that is foreshadowing and anticipating a crisis point later in the story where she makes a choice that has disastrous outcome, which she then has to redeem herself and overcome. A great little reason to make a reader want to keep on reading and find out what happens to this character and how her positive and negative attributes manifest in the story. Maybe, part of the reason she's on a new ship is because she made a decision on her old ship that led to someone being killed. And she feels so much responsibility and guilt and shame over that she's actually suffering a huge amount of insecurity and a lack of confidence. And she needs to believe in herself again and forgive herself for what she did. And we don't necessarily explain all of that in this scene, but we might hint at her snapping at other characters or being indecisive or making a small mistake of some sort and beating herself up about it in a really over-the-top way. But all these things make Marta real to us and make her the type of person we can relate to, because we all suffer insecurities or we all suffer impulsive moments. And the more we can breed that familiarity between the reader and the character, the more Marta stops just being a captain on a ship who's female and respected, and then takes that additional step of becoming a really three-dimensional character with nuances and layers that we can start to really get behind. And as I said, her strengths and weaknesses, they go an important way to foreshadowing problems and opportunities to come. Keep in mind, the whole reason we read fiction is to see a character go through a transformation of some sort, to be faced by challenges and crises that they have to overcome through internal growth and development, so that by the time they find their happy ending at the end of the story, we have seen that transformation unfold, and it's in that transformation that we learn the central themes and insights of the story. Things like love will always triumph over hate and ignorance and prejudice, or revenge only leads to you becoming the very monster that you initially wanted to destroy in your vengeance. It's through characters' internal transformations that we take these deeper morals and insights and lessons. So the more we set the character up as flawed or blind to their perceived problem, or holding a limiting belief about themselves or the world or their role in the world or other people, the more we're setting up a really strong transformational character arc, and the more compelling that character is going to be, and the more significant the plot is going to become, because it's not just about them surviving a monster or a terrible planet. It's about them growing into the hero they have to become if they're going to have any chance of overcoming the insurmountable problems that we throw at them. That growth is at the center of every story, from Rose on the Titanic, who walks away from her wealth and her privilege to be a more authentic version of herself, to Harry Potter, who starts out as an unknown, unloved orphan who's happy to stay under the stairs in the closet and dissolve into the background, and going from that to having the self-belief and the conviction to save the world. So don't forget the internal journey. It is just as relevant as the external journey, and the external journey will never carry the same kind of weight or importance if that internal journey isn't there to give it that sense of significance. And when we introduce characters at the start of the story, we're introducing those flaws and those limiting beliefs as much as we're introducing external scary things like an inexplicable disease that will likewise shape and challenge the character. So my final point is we have a lot of insights about the crew, the storm, the operations, and all of that is to be expected in sci-fi. There is a huge burden to world build, but make sure that we are crafting a scene that gives Marta an opportunity to step forward as a compelling character in her own right, and someone who is heading towards a problem of some sort that carries a personal risk or opportunity, that will then give all of those world building external elements the sense of context and significance that they need to fully grip and compel us. So that is the end of the live edit portion of today. Before I go, I wanted to thank Jessica for sharing her fabulous work with us. I think that she is a writer to watch out for. I think she has an incredible natural talent for tension and drama, and I think that as she continues to develop her craft, she's going to really create some fantastic stories, and I'm really excited to see what happens with this manuscript and how it finds its place in the world. I've got Jessica's handle there if you want to follow her. I'll also tag her in the post. But thank you, Jessica, again for taking the leap. It was a privilege to edit your work, and I really appreciate you doing that. If anyone wants to take part in the conversation, to add their own insights or pieces of feedback, ideas, maybe points that I've made that you might not necessarily agree with or that you have a different view on, please include your comments below. Obviously, I ask that all comments that you include are offered in a constructive way. This is not, like so many kind of social media interactions where it's all about throwing opinions at people. But I do want to see this as a place where writers support and love one another, and grow together through shared experiences and perspectives, because we've all dealt with these issues at different points. We all have different solutions and ideas on how to get around them. Not all of us are fortunate enough to be part of a writing group where you can meet up, in a regular way. And so just as we read each other's work in a writing group and constructively share ideas, I really believe that we can do the same thing online, as long as we maintain an air of genuine helpfulness and respect. So thank you again, Jessica. I hope that you garner some great insights from this process. I really appreciate you sharing your work with us. The other link that I have below here is for a discovery edit. Now, if you want to submit your manuscript, the opening scenes of your manuscript for an edit, that is a service that I offer. I'm only able to do 1 or 2 of those a week, so I try to reserve them for writers who are interested in developing their whole manuscript but want to experience my editing input on their work before taking that leap. So I can't guarantee that I'll be able to edit your manuscripts, but do contact me, and if there's space in my schedule, I will be absolutely happy to do that. The fee is anywhere from $50 to $100 depending on the length of your opening scenes. But you might also want to submit your opening scenes for the next Run the Gauntlet. Applications close on November 25th. If you picked up the code word earlier in this recording, make sure that in the comments section of the application form you mention that keyword, because it will give you a slight edge if I can see that you actively watch the program and really do take part in the program. Wonderful. And I've got all of those links below. Deadline is November 25th, as I said. So I look forward to seeing what you guys have next for me. We've done 2 works of sci-fi in a row and over these last 2 programs. So definitely be looking out for works of romance, action, suspense, horror. Or memoir for that matter. So if you've got something that's burning a hole in your drawer, send it through, and I'll be definitely happy to consider it for the next month's program. But thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for taking part, and I will see you again in December. Have a wonderful end of the month, and we'll catch up soon. Bye.